Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to talk to you about organic chemistry. Now, organic chemistry, sometimes fondly, sometimes not fondly known as OChem, is one of the great branches of chemistry. Organic in terms of chemistry means carbon containing compounds, carbon containing molecules. Its origin goes back to life's molecules. And so what's interesting, sometimes we think of the word organic like on the street by thinking something like agriculture that's grown without pesticides, something like that, organic farming or organic food. But in this context, we mean carbon containing molecules. And one thing about carbon containing molecules is that it's so important. And if you were majoring in biological sciences in college, you would be required, and rightfully so, to take one or more courses on organic chemistry because it is these molecules which are the basis of life's molecules. And so, what's fascinating about it is, we're mostly made up of water, but the other components of ourselves are these organic carbon containing compounds. And it's like life would be almost unimaginable without these organic compounds. And so, this video is a brief and simple look at the study of organic chemistry. If you can imagine, this is such a huge discipline. There's so much to it in terms of naming the molecules and how they react and all these synthesis reactions. But hopefully this will provide a brief introduction and it'll get you on your way to the study of organic chemistry and help you out. And so here we go. And so organic chemistry, as I said before, is the study of carbon-containing compounds. And so one of the things that I want to say is one of the most simple carbon-containing compounds is this thing down here, which is carbon dioxide. If I were to draw it like this, I would say that that black bead right there is carbon. And one of the things that you may know already about carbon is that it has a valence or a Lewis dot structure of 4. And as a result of that, it tends to form with its partner oxygen a double covalent bond. So if I drew oxygen over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it would share there and it would share there. And this would be non-polar covalent because the electronegativities between carbon and oxygen are rather similar. And so there you have it. If you were to draw it out a little bit more clear, it would be like this, a flat molecule. One of the reasons that carbon dioxide is significant, and I bring this up, is that as molecules, as organisms contain carbon-containing compounds, one of the ways in which, the major way in which carbon enters the ecosystem is in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so plants have the ability, not just plants, but algae and any photosynthetic organism like bacteria can take carbon dioxide in. And when they take carbon dioxide in, they're taking in the carbon and they're using the carbon to construct, using various pathways, construct carbon-containing molecules. And so where do we get our carbon-containing molecules? We usually consume them. We eat them, either from vegetables or from meat. But ultimately, it's the plants that are taking in the carbon from the air. And so that's the ultimate source of carbon entering into the food chain. And so the study of this is rather significant because all of the major organic compounds that we like to consider in biology, such things as carbohydrates and proteins and nucleic acids and lipids, those are the 4 major class of macromolecules. Those are all organic. So those are all containing carbon. And so the basic principles of organic chemistry are really important. And so we can say that some of the most simple ones, as I alluded to just a second ago, was carbon dioxide. And one of the most simple, or the simple, hydrocarbon, carbon and hydrogen are sort of best buddies. And so you can consider that as being CH4. You might know it as methane. And then we can add another carbon to it if we wanted to make it ethane. And so they range from very tiny little hydrocarbons like this and like this to these huge molecules of protein, for example, and huge nucleic acids. And so one of the things I want to say historically about organic compounds is that one of my favorite experiments was conducted in the 1950s by this gentleman right here, Stanley Miller, and as a graduate student of Harold Urey. And in their lab, they attempted, you may recall this somewhere in your background, they attempted to synthesize or make organic molecules. It's not too difficult to make organic molecules, it turns out, in an organic chemistry lab. The thing is, the twist of what they were doing was they were trying to create organic molecules such as this amino acid. Notice it is an organic molecule. It has a central carbon here. These are some functional groups that are coming off of it, which we'll want to discuss in a future video. This is an amine. This is a carboxylic acid. So why are amino acids important? They're the building blocks of protein. Stanley Miller attempted to create in the early atmosphere of the Earth and tried to fill this glass chamber with some of the gases such as hydrogen gas and methane gas and nitrogen gas, tried to create what would be a simulation of the early atmosphere of the Earth. And then over in another area, he had water and he heated it to a boil, which created steam. And then these bolts of electricity were simulating maybe lightning strikes, a source of energy that would break down these simple molecules into more complex organic molecules. And so in the lab, the long and the short of it is, they were able to create some of the key organic monomers of life in the lab. And so maybe this is how these organic molecules came into being billions of years ago, like approximately 3 billion years ago or 3.5 billion years ago. And so that's pretty interesting. So what's the significance of carbon? I mean, that needs to be asked before we go any further. Like, why carbon? You know, you say that organic chemistry is molecules containing carbon. What's the big deal about carbon? Why out of all 92 naturally occurring elements does carbon get favored over the others? Why is life built upon carbon? What is the story with carbon? Well, let's sort of break it down, and maybe these things are all familiar to you. Carbon has 6 electrons. You know, no big deal there. The carbon atom has 2 in the first shell and 4 in the second shell. So it has a valence of 4 outer shell electrons. And so if you look at its electronegativity, it sort of sits in the middle in terms of its desire for electrons. So therefore, and this is important, therefore carbon has little tendency to form ionic bonds. So it doesn't have the strength to pull electrons away from other atoms, nor does it have the weakness to have its electrons removed. So it's neither a donor or a receiver of electrons. Thus, it often always forms covalent bonds. And it forms 4 covalent bonds because of the fact it's trying to achieve an octet of 8. And so this is what we would call tetravalence. And as a result of this, if you don't mind, this sort of cross piece like this has many implications in terms of its architecture. Like, you could really build elaborate structures and complex molecules as a result of this tetravalence. And this is something that we'll want to consider. So covalent bonds, you know, again, what? Well, the covalent bond is very strong. And so if you want to build sort of the backbone or the internal structure of a lot of organic molecules are based on these carbon chains, which are incredibly strong. And so it's a good atom to work with. And so when carbon forms these covalent bonds with other ones, they're arranged in sort of interesting angles. I know when we draw methane gas, CH4 is the molecular formula. We can do it like this. It means carbon and hydrogen, and there's 4 hydrogens. We can draw the structure like this, but when you draw it like this, it sort of looks like it's flat onto a piece of paper or on the screen. But indeed, this is a 3-dimensional molecule. Two of the hydrogens are in the plane, but one's coming at you and one's coming in the back. And so the way we draw this in organic chemistry is this dark triangle right there suggests that the hydrogen is coming toward you, and the dotted line in the back suggests that it's going away from us. And so this kind of is how an organic chemist would display 3-dimension methane. And again, the bond angle right there is 109 degrees. So this is a tetrahedral, three-dimensionally speaking. Now, they're not all tetrahedral, these hydrocarbons or organic molecules. Sometimes, like carbon dioxide, we saw this earlier, by virtue of how it reacts with and bonds with oxygen, it's actually a planar, it's flat, and so it's 180 degrees. So it's flat, three-dimensionally speaking. I mentioned this before because I think this is extremely significant as organic chemistry relates to biology, is that this carbon dioxide, and I put it in red for huge emphasis, it's carbon dioxide is the source for all organic molecules. Sometimes a beginning biology student might say, hey, I know carbon dioxide is in the air, and I know it enters into the leaf through these little pores called stomata, and that plants are able to convert those into simple sugars like glyceraldehyde phosphate or glucose, and then ultimately sucrose. But you can then take those carbon sugars, those molecules, and break them up and add different functional groups, and there you have it. It's a source of carbon for which you can create any organic molecule, and so it's the input. And so carbon dioxide is rather significant as it enters into the ecosystem. So that's really important. So photosynthesis brings carbon in to the food chain. And so I was mentioning methane before. It's the most simple, and it's like, well, why do you say that it's the most simple? Because it has a single carbon. If I were to continue this, I might say, well, take a look at this. What would you say if we had two carbons? Well, the naming system is an interesting thing, nomenclature, and I welcome you to visit this. I'm not going to get into nomenclature, both common name and IUPAC naming of organic molecules, but it's totally fascinating. And if you're taking an organic chemistry course, certainly that's where you'd want to begin, is how to classify these molecules and name them. But I can sort of simplify it and say that if there's a single carbon, it's CH4, and then you can have two carbons, and you can continue. Let me sort of show this. If you had three carbons like this, then you would throw in the hydrogens like this, like that. Or if you had four, you would do 1, 2, 3, 4, like that. And these have names. So it's methane and it's ethane. Right here it's 2. This is propane, and this is propane, this is butane, and you continue all the way up. And so that's kind of interesting. If you throw in a double bond, you may recall this somewhere in your chemistry path, it's referred to as a unsaturated bond because there's only 2 hydrogens coming off of it instead of 1. Let me illustrate that. And when you have a double bond, you change the suffix from ane to ene. But let's do this. So this is a saturated bond, a single bond like this. And let's throw in right here a double bond. If I throw in a double bond like this, you can see that there's 3. I would only have 1 hydrogen coming off and 1 hydrogen coming off. So this would be considered an unsaturated bond, and these are the saturated bonds, or in other words, single bonds versus double bonds. Now, this is a structural formula. These are some models, ball and stick models, and this is sort of a 3-dimensional space filling model. And there's some really cool sites on the internet where you can look at these molecules and they rotate 3-dimensionally, and there's some cool apps where you can really get a sense of what these more elaborate molecules look like. It's pretty cool. Well, carbon isn't all by itself, and I know it likes to hang out with its best friend hydrogen to form hydrocarbons like I was just showing you, but these are also its good buddies too, oxygen, nitrogen as well. And so you can continue to study this and go, okay, here's some hydrogens coming off. When there's nothing written there, it's a hydrogen understood, so I won't draw the hydrogen. You might already know that. But if I put a carbon here, I can also add an oxygen. Now if I add an oxygen like this, you might know, since it has a valence of 2, it's going to always form 2 covalent bonds. And so what I'll do is I'll do that, and so this I would need to add another hydrogen. You see how that works? Or if I wanted to, I can eliminate that and eliminate that. I could just change my mind and add a hydrogen over here. And so you'll notice that the oxygen is satisfied because it forms 2 bonds, and then I would have to add a hydrogen here and a hydrogen here. This would be ethanol. This is actually drinking alcohol right there. Same thing with nitrogen. If you had nitrogen bonding with carbon, you would have 4 bonds coming off of carbon and 3 coming off of nitrogen, because it has 5 outer electrons, and therefore it'll form 3 bonds in order to acquire 8. And so this is how we roll with that. And so what's interesting, I would try to remember this, that hydrogen forms 1 bond, that oxygen always forms 2, nitrogen always forms 3, and carbon always forms 4, as far as covalent bonds. So it's this valence of carbon with its partners are sort of the building code, if you will, that govern the architecture of all these organic molecules. And so that's really significant. If you know this, and you're like, well, there's got to be more elements in this. There are, but again, you may recall that these are the critical elements of life that make up about 96%, that chomps. And so overall, these are the elements that are significant. And they're uniform from organism to organism. I think that's kind of speaks highly of the fact that all organisms have a common ancestor and descended with modification from that common ancestor over time. That's not my idea, that's Charles Darwin, I support it. But carbon's versatility with these other elements can build almost an inexhaustible amount of molecules. It's sort of like if you have Hot Wheel tracks or Thomas train tracks, you can kind of do whatever you want with these molecules. You can start building things like this. You can start making long chains of carbon like that, and then you can throw a nitrogen on it like this, and then you can start doing this kind of thing. You can put another nitrogen here. You see how I'm rolling like that? And so you can just keep creating all of this interesting, almost infinite amount of possibilities here. And so this is critical because, as you may know, the diversity of life ultimately has its source in the diversity of organic molecules that compose it. I mean, we see things physically in terms of like phenotype and physical manifestation, but ultimately it's the chemicals that are diverse that results in these physical differences. And that's critical because variation ultimately will provide the possibilities that some varieties are better than others. Like this fork is better than this fork, and so therefore it has a preferential success in terms of surviving, and then thus has greater fitness, and ultimately this is how natural selection works. So it comes down to organic chemistry. I'm trying to I'm very excited about that. And so in addition to carbon dioxide and methane and ethane, there's other important molecules that I just want to toss out. I'm not going to list every critical organic molecule, but this one's pretty significant. This is urea. This is a nitrogen-containing molecule. There's only 1 carbon here, and it has 2 amino groups over here on the side, nitrogen and H2. And so you can see here's the drawing, here's the 3-dimensional ball and stick model. This is important. This is a compound that when nitrogen compounds are broken down in our cells, oftentimes urea is produced as a waste, and therefore it enters into the bloodstream, and our kidneys help to filter this out, and this is a major component of urine, urea. And so that's kind of an important molecule. But you can see it corresponds to all of the rules, and you're like, well, wait, how come it's NH2 over here? Well, it's just abbreviated. It's like you could take some shortcuts like that. Like, for example, if I had something that was CH3 and then CH2, 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 CH3, I might get a little lazy about this. And watch this. Do you see how the C terminal, the C on the end here, I can draw that as CH3, and then I can connect that, and these are CH2, CH2s. I can do parentheses CH2, like that, and then put a CH3 over here at the end. So let me sort of help you out with that. So that CH3 is this one. This CH3 is this one. And you're like, wait a minute, 1, 2, 3, 4. Then I would write a 4 here to represent the inside of the molecule. It's kind of a shorthand version of it. And ultimately, what I really want to say about that is I could do really an N. Whoops. I can put an N right there to represent any of these in between. So some of this shorthand steps in organic chemistry, and I'll show you another shorthand in a second. But ultimately, these carbon chains, like right here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And there's different things that can come off of it. And I say things, I mean functional groups. This happens to be a hydroxide that give the parent molecule, the carbon chain, doesn't have to be a chain, it could even be a ring, but the parent molecule, its unique functionality. So if there's a hydroxyl group, you might know this, it gives this particular molecule polarity. As you can see, there's many hydroxyl groups, so this would be a hydrocarbon that is a polyhydroxyl, which signifies, if you know what the properties are of an hydroxyl, you'll know that that's a polar covalent bond holding that together. So therefore water would adhere with this molecule, so therefore this is a polar molecule forming many hydrogen bonds. So this happens to be a sugar, if you recognize that. But what I'm getting at is these skeletons, as I was mentioning before, can be really diverse. They could be straight chains like this. You're like, wait a minute. Well, instead of drawing the C to C to C, like I'll do that. And so instead of drawing it like this, like that, and then like that, and then like this, so this is how we roll if I'm making a big hydrocarbon chain. And so you're like, well, you didn't draw in the hydrogens. Maybe I don't want to. Maybe it's understood. And it's like, well, if I'm not going to do that, then maybe I don't even need to draw in the carbons itself. And so check this out. Everywhere there's a point, like right there, and right there, and right there, and right there, and right there, represents a carbon. So everywhere there's a point, there's a carbon. Right there, and right there. And so I can represent something that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as being 1, which is right there, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the reason that it's going up, down like that is because that's what it looks three-dimensionally. So those points represent carbons and hydrogen. So this is the hydrocarbon. Here's a double bond. Notice I'm drawing in the hydrogens here. You're like, well, why there around the double bond? I know that there's only one hydrogen. You're saying to yourself because there needs to be 4 bonds. I don't need that. You do need it around a double bond because the thing is, the hydrogens could be going in a downward direction, or one of them could be in an up and the other one could be down. And so this is something we're going to look at in a moment. It's called a geometric isomer. So those do need to be drawn in. And again, this is a functional group over here on the end of the molecule, which gives it some unique property. And so you can draw these like straight chains, you can have branches, you can even have rings, or cyclo something. You can have rings of carbon, or the length of the hydrocarbon chain, the parent molecule, could be long, could be short. So almost inexhaustible. There's so many different possibilities. You can go, short or really, really long. You can have branching like this, and you can have double bonds intermittently found in the molecule. You can have rings like this. Do you notice how, if I were to count this, here's a little check for understanding. I'll just mark them. 1, 2, I'm doing carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let me check it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Excellent. So this represents cyclohexane. And this is benzene. You can see there's the double bonds over here at the ene. So benzene, it looks like this. And so organic chemists don't want to draw out all of this, not because they're lazy, but simply because they can take a shorthand, and everyone knows it. Everyone knows what this is. What's really cool is that when I say everyone, I mean everyone, like internationally, chemistry structure, and the IUPAC naming is also international. The common name of some of these molecules can be run into difficulty. But if you follow the international system of nomenclature, then everyone in the world is calling these molecules by the same name, which is pretty neat. Another example of a larger hydrocarbon that's of significance is something called a triglyceride. It's these long carbon chains with many hydrogens. It sort of looks like the letter E. And this is how organisms store extra energy in the form of these triglycerides. And so they can actually be inside. This red structure is a cell. And so all of these cells are pretty similar. We call it a tissue. This is called adipose tissue. and it's where triglycerides are stored. This is under the light microscope. So pretty neat. Hydrocarbons, in terms of what do they do, that's a fair question. You're like, well, what's the point? Well, they could be lipids. They could store energy. And even outside of biology, like petroleum, like fossil fuels and oil, ultimately had their source. When we say fossil fuel, ultimately the oil and coal that we use to power most of our world came from living organisms of the past, like the great forests of the past millions and millions of years ago, that have now been converted through geology into oil and coal. And so we burn hydrocarbons for energy. Now that'll be a different discussion. That I'm not going to get into how the bond energy of hydrocarbons, but I'll just simply say that in addition to being a source of carbon to build all important organic molecules, we could burn it for energy. Although the thing is about these fossil fuels is that they're limited. That's another discussion. I won't go into it, but we should probably back away from fossil fuels because they're running out, and which is going to increase the tension in the world as we compete for these fossil fuels. So that's important. And so let's get into the conversation of isomers. You may know that the term isomer means same molecular formula. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hydrogens. You're like, okay. But then look at this guy over here. 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons. Interesting. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Same molecular iso. Same molecular formula. Different structure. This is what we mean by an isomer. These two molecules have different properties than one another because they're like different keys. You're like, different keys have different shapes, therefore they can open different kinds of locks. And so this is a conversation that I want to have about isomers. It's a brief one, but we have three kinds of isomers, and one of them is a structural isomer. And so butane and isobutane, this is butane, this is isobutane, are isomers of one another. They have the same molecular formula and different structure. Now, another example of structural isomers that I think are really important in biology are things like glucose. Okay, you might know this somewhere in your past. You're like, glucose, of course, it's C6H12O6. I am knowledgeable, you're saying. But then I'm like, hey, wait a second. Fructose, which is a different monosaccharide, is also C6H12O6. You're like, how can that be? Well, they're structural isomers of one another. They're drawn differently. The body reacts to them differently. They taste different. So they have different physical properties as a result of their structural differences. So structural isomers. That's one of the three types of isomers that I'm going to discuss in a moment. And then we have something called geometric isomer. I alluded to this earlier in the video. When there's a double bond, it creates a three-dimensional option to whether or not you have X. I've put X because it doesn't have to be a hydrogen. It could be anything. It could be a chlorine. It could be an amino group. It could be anything up here. But you can have the X functional group either in an up-up orientation or down-down. It means the same thing. If it's up-up or down-down, it's the same thing. We refer to that in organic chemistry as a cis orientation. But the other possibility, which is different, is if there is a down-up or up-down. That is referred to as trans. So up-down is trans, up-up is cis. These are called geometric because they're three-dimensionally different spatially in terms of their carbon, and this only occurs around a double bond, a carbon-to-carbon double bond. Because, as it turns out, the double bond doesn't allow the atoms to rotate freely around that. And if you're struggling to understand that, I recommend playing with some plastic models of molecules. You can really sense a cis and trans, and it's rather significant. I'll bring this up again when we get into a discussion of lipids in terms of cis fatty acids and trans fatty acids in terms of their physical ability to affect our health in the body. And so here's another example of this just to drive the point home. If the molecule has a double bond between the carbons and they're the functional groups are in an up-up, it's cis. Or could it be down-down and cis as well? But up-down is trans. So these would be trans. You may have heard of this before, like a trans fatty acid or trans fats. This is what it would be, up-down. So here's a trans, here's a cis. Now, one other example other than fatty acids, I find this to be very interesting in terms of physiology, is that when light comes into our eyes, it goes through our cornea, and then it goes through the pupil, and then it gets refracted by our lens, and then focused on the back of the eye called the retina. And the retina has specialized cells called rods and cones, which are photoreceptors that actually pick up light. And what light is a wave. And what's interesting is the wave comes down and it can strike this molecule called rhodopsin. And maybe you've heard of it before. It's pretty cool looking right here, rhodopsin. And when it hits it, it can change the geometric isomer from a cis to a trans, which is a very minor physical alteration in terms of its three-dimensional component, but enough so that the molecule in the trans state, when light strikes it, changes its shape, which then, if that rhodopsin is embedded in a protein in the membrane of the cell, it might influence the protein shape because of its shape change, and that could possibly allow solutes to pass through these membrane permease proteins and therefore affect the polarity of the cell itself and cause a depolarization and a nerve impulse. And so ultimately, this is a quick example, and it's superficially explained, I might add, of how the structure of organic molecules manifests into the physical phenomena that we know as vision. Pretty interesting. And then ultimately, the third kind of isomer is called an enantiomer. And so these are called mirror image isomers. And so look at this molecule of carbon. So here's carbon in the center. In order to have an enantiomer, you have to have 4 different things coming off of your carbon. So here's CH2H, here's an amino, here's a methyl, and a hydrogen coming off. When you look at yourself in the mirror, it's sort of like, well, I don't know how to describe it, the opposite or reverse or mirror image. It's like your left hand and your right hand. And you're like, well, what's the significance of this? Well, in some instances, the body, in terms of enzymes and how they react to this, the body will recognize one enantiomer and not the other. And so it will use one as a substrate and ignore another one based on this isomer. And so 2 examples of this is that there's a drug that's used to reduce morning sickness in pregnancy. And as it turns out, one of them is fairly effective enantiomer at doing that, but the other enantiomer is quite dangerous. So that's an extreme example that can cause birth defects. You have to be very careful about that in terms of your creating that medicine or that pharmaceutical in an organic lab. Very careful about that. And then also, you might have heard of Parkinson's disease. There's an isomer called L-DOPA, and there's a D-DOPA, which is not very effective, and the L-DOPA is. The L and the D have to do with, this is a kind of a detail that I'm going to explain rather simply. When you shoot plain polarized light, like straight waves of light at it, and the molecule refracts the light to the left, it's considered to be L, and to the right, it's considered to be D. And so these are enantiomers of one another. This one works well, this one doesn't work at all. So it's kind of interesting. So I hope you enjoyed this brief look at organic chemistry. If you're going to be studying biology in the future, which it would be a great thing, let me assure you, you'll be taking multiple organic chemistry classes, and you'll really be getting into it. And one of the things is sometimes OChem has a reputation as being very difficult, and I'm not going to say that it's not, but it's what you make of it. If you approach it properly, maybe you can make it a little bit easier for yourself. And if you constantly embrace it and know that it's significant and valuable, you'll get so much more out of it. And what did we expect? Do we expect life to be simple? I've never expected that. I don't think you should as well. I welcome the challenge. I welcome the difficulty of organic chemistry. Bring it. That's my approach. So I hope you enjoyed this brief look at organic chemistry. Thanks for watching.